This attorney sits on the boards of large public companies, rubs shoulders with an Oracle billionaire, matches long-term oriented investors with companies seeking quality shareholders, wrote 20 books, and more. I spoke with Larry Cunningham, special counsel at Mayer Brown, and you are listening to episode 26 of the Future is Bright podcast. I am your host, Chris Batts. So, welcome, Larry, to the Future is Bright podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Great to be here, Chris.
So I was just delighted. I didn't know if I could even catch you with the journey you've been on to be on my show. And there's lots of personal reasons and professional reasons that I'd love my audience to learn more about you, Larry. And so when I found out that you weren't just an author, but you were also an attorney and you're at Mayer Brown now, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I got to get him on the show. So I'd love to kind of just start off. You're in Manhattan, correct?
Yes, I am.
And you also live in New York. You're a New Yorker, correct?
Yeah, I've lived in Manhattan for about 30 years now.
30 years. That's awesome. Are you originally from the area?
Originally from Wilmington, Delaware. So
Okay.
area in a sense.
Pretty close, yeah. And married and kids, correct?
Yeah, very happily married with two wonderful children.
That's excellent. Tell me, how did this journey begin for you to consider being a lawyer?
Well, I'm from Delaware, and as you know, Delaware is the leading producer of corporate law in the world. So I think I had that in my blood. And so from a very early, in high schoolish, I had a sense of what corporate law was, and it was a strong enough sense that I decided to explore it.
You had shared with me during undergrad that you had this history with a renowned Wall Street firm. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, undergrad was at the University of Delaware, and to make money, the side job I got during school and then for the summers was at Skadden Arps. I guess we call it Skadden now. It used to be called Skadden Arps, Sleet, Marr, and Flom. They had just opened a Wilmington office. They were one of the first New York law firms to open in Delaware. And so they were growing. And through my sister, I ended up getting a job there as a messenger. And I continued to work my way up at Skadden over the next 5 or 6 years.
And I mean, that's extraordinary. What an amazing opportunity. I assume you quickly learned the rigor and culture of a Wall Street law firm.
I did. It was a wonderful office. So the lawyers at Skadden were terrific. They were entrepreneurial. They're opening this new office, and they had to care about the Delaware culture because a lot of Delaware lawyers didn't like the idea of this big New York law firm coming. So they had to navigate the culture of the bar and run this law firm and be entrepreneurial. And I got a front row seat to all of that. And I have to say, I think this group of lawyers who started that office and then who grew it, who I got to know over 6 or so years, were an amazing group. And I'm still in touch with many of them, although some of them are retired or passed away. But it was a phenomenal group, and it was a great front row seat for me.
Yeah, and a front row seat during the 80s, which is like roaring M&A days. Oh my goodness.
I mean, so I was litigation, mostly. They had a little bit of corporate, was mostly heavy duty takeover litigation. And
Okay.
I started out as a messenger, and then I worked my way up to first I was a clerk, and then a paralegal, and then a summer associate. And so I was helping out in some very small way, but big cases, including Moranicus, Household Finance, Unical, Revlon, CD against Technicolor. So it had something to do with all of those. And I was paying attention. I was trying to understand the substance of it. I don't know how well I did at that time, but I think I certainly learned a lot about the stakes.
Now, at what point during that process you're like, I got to be a lawyer?
It was pretty early on. I really
Okay.
did like this team of people, and I liked
Yeah.
what they were doing, both in terms of the law and the arguments, developing the record, making the case, but also the culture of collaboration internally, a polite adversarial posture externally. I mean, these are it's a small bar in Delaware. It still is, but it was really small then. So you're on the other side of cases, and sometimes on the same side, So there's a collegiality even amid the adversity. So I found it very attractive. Now the small twist was as I evolved my own career, I decided I was more interested in the corporate transactional structuring rather than the fighting and the litigation. But
And was it law school that helped you see more of that corporate route because you had spent so much time in litigation at Skadden?
yeah, well, and Skadden helped a little too because I did get a little exposure in Delaware to the corporate side, and then when I became a summer associate, I split the time between Delaware and New York, and in New York I did all corporate, and that's when we were preparing to conduct a takeover, so preparing a 13D filing and preparing a tender offer document, and I got real excited about putting it together rather than fighting over it.
What an extraordinary opportunity. I mean, were you a shoe-in when you were at law school trying to, become a summer associate?
I don't think so. But the era was favorable. It was 1987, so
Yeah.
there was a lot of demand for legal services. The markets were hot and abuzz, so the law firms were hiring. As your listeners will know, it's in some years it's harder for any given student to get a
Yeah.
job. In others, it was easier. I think in my period, I think it was relatively easier. So I was fortunate in that way.
So you went to Cardozo, uh,
Yeah. Yeah,
and
great school. Yeah, and back then it was. Now it's, I think, a very well recognized, established school. It's 45 years old. It's got graduates and all the wonderful appointments and opportunities. But then it was a bit of a gamble. I was in the 10th class or early days for the school. But it did have a good start. Part of a big major research university with a lot of support intellectually and financially. So. And they supported. They gave me. They were very generous to me, making it very attractive for me to take that chance. So I did go there and enjoyed it very much.
it, so I love this story. You were entertaining offers from law firms, and you ultimately chose not to go with Skadden. Tell us about that.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, Skadden was a top choice, and I
Yeah.
certainly would have jumped at it. I really enjoyed all the people, all the transactions, all the cases, and made a lot of friends. I also got an offer from Cravath, Swain and Moore, which I think still today, but certainly for that time and for who I was, seemed so more than too good to be true.
Yeah.
And so I talked to all my colleagues, my mentors at Skadden about the choice and the trade offs, and it incrementally made sense for me to take Cravath. I mean, a couple of the big reasons were first, at that time, Cravath never hired anyone laterally. So the only time in those days you could get a job at Cravath was straight out of law school.
Yeah.
Whereas Skadden made a practice of hiring lawyers from other law firms. And so there was a sort of a logical sense that, well, I could work for Cravath for say 4 or 6 years or something and then move over to Skadden. But if I started at Skadden for 4 or 6 years, I couldn't move over to Cravath. So that was an important factor. I think those facts are still similar today.
They are.
Cravath doesn't often hire laterally, but it does. So that's changed. And the other thing, Cravath, big litigation powerhouse, but I think they had focused on more heavily and more nearly exclusively on big time corporate transactional work than on other things. Skadden did everything by that time and does everything now. Cravath obviously does a lot of different things then and now, but there was a sense that was a premier corporate outfit. So that combination of reasons made me take that opportunity.
Yeah, it makes complete sense, and they're both amazing firms. But you're right, things have kind of remained the same still at that point. Um, so, what were you up to at Cravath? You mentioned corporate, but what particular type of things were you working on?
Well, at Cravath, they have a rotation system then and now where associates move through different practice areas, spending about a year on average, 10 months to 16 or 18 in different groups headed by a small team of partners, usually 3 or 4 people, focused on particular transactional context. So I spent, I went through 4 rotations. I spent those in underwriting, doing asset-backed securities, and
Okay.
pioneering the securitization market. And then I did M&A with some real heavy hitting partners. Sam Butler, who was the presiding partner, Rob Kindler, who went on and is now spun around. He's at Paul Weiss, doing front page big time M&A as a younger person, but nevertheless at that firm then and now I think it was pretty thinly staffed. So I did a lot of work early on, a lot of responsibilities. Then the third group I was in an international group, just big multinationals, like it was Guinness, which is Diageo today, Shell, British Petroleum, and just dealing with their multiple cross-border problems, whether doing capital raises or general banking or acquisitions. And so I got to work with some amazing people in that area too. Jim Edwards and Ben Crane, just fabulous people. And then did a little stint in the banking area, working with again, extraordinary people, very good banking group over there. And I'm still friends again with quite a few of the people, especially my peers, but also some of the partners from that area too. Great, I enjoyed it immensely.
I imagine it would have been really enjoyable and just such a front row seat to all the action. So at what point, Larry, did you begin to kind of get that feeling that you wanted to teach? Because I know you were at Cravath for 4 to 6 years at least.
Yeah,
When did that
I
start
guess it was
happening?
always in the back of my mind. I like
Okay.
the academic side of law school. I was on the law review. I wrote a note and had it published, and then as a third year, I was an editor on the law review. And my main job was helping second years write their notes. So it was very scholarly, research oriented activity, and I loved it. So that also enabled me to make friends with several of the faculty. So it was always somewhat in the back of my mind. And I guess in around my fourth year at Cravath, Cardozo needed a corporate law. The school I went to said we need to find my own teacher was retiring from there.
Okay.
Elliot Weiss, my corporations professor, he was retiring. And so they wanted to find some younger person to fill that spot. And Elliot suggested me, and the committee reached out and asked me, would I throw my hat into this ring? And yeah, the light went off. I thought, yeah, that'd be interesting. So that was really the first time it became formal.
That's so fun. Yeah, and it wasn't a little, it was a journey to get to that point eventually, correct?
Yeah, well, Elliot said, "Hey, Larry, you ought to try out for this job." I quickly learned from the committee members that they weren't in the market for doing people favors or
Yeah.
helping their own or anything of that sort. They said, "Look, if you want to be considered for a professor job at Cardozo, you have to be willing to take a professor job at any law school in the country. This is a very competitive job market. It's not easy to get these things, and we're not just going to give it to you." So before I agreed to be considered at Cardozo, I had to agree that if I got a job somewhere at one of the 175 law schools, then I had to take it. So I went through the process, which was a grueling, arduous process and very difficult for a young, now Cardozo is only 12 years old. Most of those jobs go to people who've gone to Yale, Columbia, and Harvard. They consider Penn slumming it. So it was it took effort, but I got 5 offers from very schools I would have been happy to go to: University of Tennessee, Capital University in Columbus, Ohio, Detroit Law School, which is now Michigan State. They weren't necessarily my favorite geographies or the A plus opportunity long term, but they were very good for me at the time. So I was able to tell Cardozo, yeah, I'm very serious about this life, this job, and that did help me get the job. Cardozo gave me the job.
It makes sense, and I'm glad the stars aligned for you to still land that role. So you were at Cardoza for a number of years, and as far as I understand, you ran their corporate governance center. What does that mean?
One of the neatest opportunities at Cardozo is they have a lot of friends and a lot of programs. It's a very vibrant intellectual atmosphere in very many subjects. And one of them was corporate governance, that they had a center that was funded and founded by Samuel and Ronnie Heyman. They
Okay.
were famous in the 80s and 90s as business leaders. They're both trained lawyers, but they were non-practicing lawyers. They're business leaders. And Sam in particular had done a lot of takeover work, and I had gotten acquainted with him through Skadden. So they endowed this center, and the school asked me to be its director. And so I dove in and just was very energetic around programming, symposia, events, classes, visiting scholars. And so I ran that I ran or co-ran it for about eight or 10 years. And it was, we did a lot of really interesting, productive things in that program.
Um, but that wasn't your only stop. You ended
Well,
up going
yeah,
to other schools.
yeah.
Was it
After 10 years at Cardozo, I did enjoy it very much. But I was the homegrown kid and hadn't seen anything else. So when Boston College Law School was looking for somebody in my field, they called me. I was interested, so I went up and visited at BC for a year. I enjoyed it a lot. Really enjoyed the colleagues and the students, and so they offered me a really nice appointment. And so with a bit of a heavy heart leaving Cardozo, I went up to Boston.
and do you were you immediately a dean, or did that give to you after that?
Yeah, it came after a couple of years.
Okay.
The head dean was John Garvey, who was a
Okay.
phenomenal dean, but had a slightly different agenda from many of the other faculty. He was a little conservative in a lot of different ways, and some faculty sort of um, weight was a little more progressive. And so they sometimes didn't talk to each other or talked past each other. So I was a centrist, and so John asked me to be the academic dean, and my main job in that process was to promote peace between the different views and sort of finding points of unity. And so they could have different ideologies, but I united them around principles of scholarly excellence and teaching innovation and things like that. I had a pretty good time, even if it wasn't always easy.
I can imagine. Just asking a question kind of in general of your roles within law schools. What was it like to be on the academic side when you had colleagues, friends, and very active, private practitioners? Is there a lot of conversation back and forth? Is it kind of separate? I'm curious from your perspective what that was like.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are pretty clear cultural differences between academic law in a university setting and practicing law in a firm or within a large company. The pace, the priorities, the value system is a lot of it's quite different. So it's sort of fun to have a foot in both worlds. But I'll tell you an old joke that I don't your listeners may find amusing, because I was asked this question of, what's the difference between the sort of the corporate world and the academic world, and I said, well, in the corporate world, it's dog eat dog, and in the academic world, it's exactly the other way around. Uh, and, and when I first told that story to an academic audience, one very astute member said, "Oh, so you mean in the academic world, it's God eat God?" And I thought, yeah, that's right.
More ways than one, I'm sure. Oh my goodness. So, uh, and again, Boston wasn't your last stop.
Yeah, right. Boston. I like Boston College, especially Boston College, a great deal, and I enjoyed Boston. But as I said earlier, even when I was living in Boston, I had a place in New York, and so came back and forth. And then right around this is Sarbanes Oxley had the Enron scandal and those sorts of scandals, the fin de siècle scandals around 2001, 2, 3. Had reverberations through Sarbanes Oxley in 2002 and 3 and 4 and 5, and there became this political and legal shift in the production of corporate governance that used to be primarily Delaware or state law, and it began to also be Washington, D.C. And that sort of caught my attention, and I was involved in some policy formulation and debates that led George Washington University for me to develop a relationship with George Washington University, and they then asked if I'd be interested in joining their faculty, and they created an opportunity that was just so compelling. I had to take it, so I went down
Couldn't
there.
refuse. Good for you. Um, I mean, I just have so many questions. I mean, differences between the law schools, obviously differences from the regions. Three very different neighborhoods and states that you lived in. In DC, was it the Maryland or the Virginia side?
Yeah, I was right near the border of both. I think all three of those schools they are different, but difference in geography, obviously, and age and size, and sort of reach. Cardozo has historically been primarily a city-ish or maybe state. BC is more of a regional. New England, GW is much more national, and BC is pretty small. Cardozo is kind of medium. GW is on the larger side. But the one thing, so that that's all true. The one thing that all three of them really did have in common was that a commitment to scholarly excellence. Slightly different degrees and focus, but that was the culture of what I liked about the university life is exploring ideas and debating ideas and being able to write basically on any topic that I wanted. And all three of those schools supported that, which was very important to me.
I mean, you've spent a couple of decades teaching, correct? Was it,
Yeah, it was 30 years altogether. Yeah, I counted them up a year or two ago, and it was exactly 30.
um, do you miss it?
No, I'm fine. I mean, I really thought hard about. So I turned 60 a year or 2 years ago, and that was the
Okay.
anniversary of my 30th anniversary of teaching. So it was a natural time for reflection and assessment. And my assessment was that I had had a good run, a great run, in some ways, in university life, and that it was time for me to pivot and go more deeply into real world, let's call it, corporate governance, and so that's what I did. And I guess there are parts that I missed, but I don't dwell on that. I really focus on what I'm doing now.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. And let's talk about that. So, um, there are a number of things that you've been a part of. Um, can we jump into Quality Shareholders Group for a moment?
Yeah, yeah, sure. This actually a program that I developed at GW. Another nice thing about all three of those schools is they encourage what I call academic entrepreneurship. You
Okay.
don't have to be an academic entrepreneur if you don't want to, but all three of those schools support people like me who wanted to do innovative programming and creative research. And so one of the things I did at GW is I created a research project around the relevance of shareholders to corporate performance. A somewhat researched area, but pretty overlooked. Most people thinking about performance, they think about managers, products, and research, and M&A savvy and capital allocation prowess, and all that's good and relevant. But it's also valuable to have a certain kind of shareholder, and we call them the quality shareholders to designate that this cohort tends to be very long term and very focused. They're
Okay.
not short-term traders, and they're not indexers. They're focused on particular companies. So that project began as an academic project, researching and writing about, doing empirical work on do those traits matter? Do they translate into a company's success? And we found evidence that they can, and so often do. And that research got some attention from many companies and some investors. And so I sort of spun out the research part to a consulting business called Quality Shareholders Group, that which you're referring to.
How exciting. So help me understand that entrepreneurial edge that you've spun out of GW. Um, I mean, the language I see is matchmaking, but is it mostly education based? Is it like consulting, or are you actually matching investors with corporations?
It's exactly that. So there are two streams. One is the pure research stream that I located at GW, and then I think it's still operable, I still nurture the research. But then I relatively quickly became a matchmaking, as you said, where um, clients will retain me to help them on the company side attract these long-term focused shareholders, and on the investor side to help discern. They have a sort of appetite. You don't want to be focused in long term with every company. You got it. So there is an alignment, like you call it matchmaking. And so that I have helped both cohort, both sides, if you like, connect with one another. And so it's very much a matchmaking project, I guess.
So fascinating. I'm in the matchmaking business too. I mean, we do executive search, but for you, I'm assuming it's institutional money. Or are we talking family office or high net worth individuals?
Yeah, we don't have those kind of limits. Certainly on the consulting side, we have a lot of relationships with family offices and high net worth individuals, and they sometimes benefit the most from our research and introductions and coaching. The big quality shareholders like Fidelity or T. Rowe Price or Brown Brothers Harriman, they don't need my help
Yeah.
as much. But some smaller funds have, and by small I mean 1, 2, 3 billion or 5 billion, not 100. And so, but on the research side, the research has mostly been on, the 13F filers, just where we can get public information to do the analysis. So our conclusions are, that's the sample size or sample cohort, but we it generalizes pretty reasonably.
And I'm just going to play ignorant for a moment. I know the answer, but why? What's the benefit?
Yeah, it's they're about there are a whole bunch of them, and I wrote a whole book about it. But just to reel off a few of the key things is the quality shareholder is focused on your business and wants to understand your business and take the time to think about it. And not all investors are like that. I mean, the short-term investors could care less. They're looking at the stock price, and that could pressure managers to do things that don't make sense. Even the indexers, who are very, very patient, they don't always care about it. They often can't care about the business model. So they tend to lean towards general principles and one size fits all prescriptions, and that can interfere with a company's strategy. And the related aspect of that is that you can draw upon this group of shareholder types as a brain trust. You can call them, talk to them, get insight, ask questions. With the day traders, they're in and out. You can't talk to them, and with indexers, it's hard. It's often hard to get them on the phone or to get them interested in what you're doing. And then versus the day traders, you get a long runway. Those quality shareholders will be patient through difficult periods. They're not stupid. They're not sycophants. They won't stay with you even if you start making really stupid decisions. But they will give you the runway you need. And likewise, compared to the indexers, they will listen on difficult topics, whether it's dividend policy, selling a subsidiary, or hot button ESG type issues. Listen to your point of view, and will very often be more willing to vote with you than with a one size fits all template. So there are lots of advantages. Those are some that are obvious to me.
And is it safe to say that long-term oriented shareholders kind of revert to the mean as far as the volatility that a price might feel versus the short-term kind of people that constantly get in and out? Does it affect
Oh
stock
yeah,
price?
no, absolutely. That's a great point. Yeah, I mean, we did some research around the sort of testing companies with a high proportion of holders who we say are quality shareholders versus low, and then related to that to stock price volatility, and found that there's less volatility with a quality shareholder with high quality shareholder population. So that's a very good example. And that's kind of what we did in the research. We said let's try to relate shareholder quality to. I think we ended up looking at 25 different important features of corporate life, stock price volatility. But we looked at at brand strength. We looked at market share. We looked at stability of earnings, a variety of other things. We looked at very specific things like, and from sort of the shareholder side, like board composition, attendance at shareholder meetings, quality of the shareholder letters that the CEO writes, and again, all that stuff is we ended up putting it all in pretty much one book called Quality Shareholders, and it's fascinating stuff, and it's more appreciated now than it used to be, but
Yeah.
it's still a kind of a niche area.
Yeah. Yeah. It still is. It still runs against the mainstream current, which is good for business.
Yes.
It's good for business. There's so much good stuff, Larry. I want to continue moving. So you are at Mayor Brown. What's going on there?
Well, that's thanks. I love Mayor Brown, and Mayor Brown's one of the top law firms in the world, almost by any measure. It's top 20 in terms of lawyers or revenues. And I think one of the neat things is it's a formidable practice in all of the major capital markets of the world. It's the only law firm that has more than 200 lawyers in each of New York, Frankfurt, I'm sorry, New York, London, and Hong Kong. And it's achieved that by a very thoughtful, strategic business model that I find just very attractive. It's organized for the long term. It's organized for sustainability, for growth. It cares about its people, cares greatly about its clients. So it's neat. And I just developed a relationship with one of their top partners. Was part of one of the innovative programs I ran at GW. So I'd gotten to know her. Name's Anna Pinedo, and I've worked with her for more than 10 years. And so when I signaled that I was going to be pivoting from the university, she reached out to inquire whether I'd be interested in joining Mayor Brown, and we talked about what I would do and what she's trying to do, what the firm's trying to do, and it seemed like a perfect fit. So I said yes, and I've been enjoying it.
That's awesome. What are you guys doing?
Corporate governance and public companies. And it kind of goes back to that Sarbanes-Oxley story I was telling, where historically corporate governance was state based. In
Okay.
the past couple decades, the federal law has increasingly partnered or touched on that, and so law firms benefit from people who are skilled in both worlds and have a sense of the interaction around between those two laws and the related ecosystems in corporate governance. And Mayor Brown has been very good at that for a very long time, and wants to solidify those strengths and maybe put a spotlight on them, put an umbrella around them. And so I'm part of the group that's doing that.
Is it safe to say that your role at Mayor Brown is to advise boards, public company boards?
Yeah, that's the primary function, and by design and by default by the action.
Yeah.
And boards, they increasingly benefit from having focused expert advice around corporate governance. The job has become bigger than it used to be. Expectations of directors are grander than
Yeah.
they used to be, and so it's a growth area, for good or bad, in society. It's a growth area for corporate governance board advisors, including me.
Yeah. It's an exciting area. It sounds like you probably are like a kid with candy. I mean, you've been doing this all your life and now coming back and working for Mayor.
It is kind of nice. I'll tell you another quip or a joke that when I was in university, once in mid career, I guess I was at Boston College, and I asked a senior colleague about preparation for class. His name was Hugh Alt, who's a very famous tax professor, and I said, Professor Alt, how much time do you spend preparing for an hour lecture, let's say? And he said, Larry, I spend 30 years and 30 minutes.
Right.
And I just, as the years rolled along, I realized that, um, as you teach more and more classes, the immediate prep time is smaller, but you're
That's
bringing this, this growing experience and example set. And you're exactly right, Chris. I mean, I feel like that. it's neat. It is wonderful. It's platonic that I'm able to deploy the experience, the accumulated insights, and it is fun. It's really rewarding.
Well, it's extraordinary, and it's again, pleasure to have you on the show. Let's dive into some of that active work you're doing. So you sit on several boards, and not just any boards. I'm nerding out here because I understand these companies. I know their history, and it just oozes all the values that you've written about, which we'll also touch on. So, um, uh, you sit on Constellation's board, and the renowned Mark Leonard, who, I mean, it's just extraordinary, their story, their returns. You sit on Markel with Tom Gaynor, who, again, renowned, has these extraordinary returns and stories. Kelly and Partners, or Kelly Plus Partners, is a CPA network. Um, and then I don't want to leave out the Museum of American Finance. You're on that as well. Would love to kind of just hear any sort of anecdotal thoughts on those four boards.
Well, thanks. Well, I'll take the museum first since you mentioned
Okay.
it.
Yeah.
I've been a fan and a friend of that museum since pretty much its founding. It's about 35-ish years old. It was founded by John Herzog, who's a famous investor, now quite elderly, but super, but spry and bright and focused. But he was a partner at Herzog Heine Geduld, which was one of, I would call them the quintessential quality shareholder, long term and focused. And I met John and his firm way back near the founding of the museum. I had just published a book, The Essays of Warren Buffett. I think we might talk about it later.
Yeah.
And I was just trying to get it distributed. It was hard to do that at first. John and the museum were one of my first customers where we started selling large quantities. So I became friends with the museum. And then fast forward, I was involved in a lot of their events over the years. They've got a vibrant program of conferences, speaker series, and visits. And so I just stayed friends. And then at some point, I joined the editorial board of their magazine called
Okay.
Financial History, and started writing articles for them. And then joined the board 6 or 7 years ago, I guess, and I've loved it. It's a great group of people. It's an important mission. It's focused on educating people about the importance of finance in American history and American life. So the outreach includes teaching junior high school and high school students, mostly in the New York metropolitan area, about personal finance, markets, capital, and so it's super rewarding. I love it. I commend listeners to check it out if you don't know about the Museum of American Finance. Just wonderful programming. It's been an honor to be with them. In terms of those corporates, I think the each company is different, obviously, but what unites all three of those and others I'm associated with is that sense we've been talking about long term and focused, and really thinking deeply and hard about how to organize a business, how to attract high quality shareholders, how to help your people do the best that they can. And so one motif of all three of them, which is I think why I ended up at these three boards, is a belief in autonomy, that the operational philosophy in each place is to give decision making power to the persons closest to a decision, so that line personnel might be making decisions about how to lay out a plant, or coders at the software company, or they're helping determine how and when to do a rewrite of a product. People closest to the customers at the accounting firm get to decide what's the right product and packaging and pricing. So that's that it's not unique, but it's not common.
It's
Most
not.
organizations have a control system, a command structure, a hierarchical arrangement. These companies tend to prefer a more flat organization. So, to your point earlier about my quality shareholders group bucking the trend or the mainstream, these companies and the philosophy around them is likewise special, and I think that's one of the reasons I end up on boards of companies like these.
I mean, among the value investing world, or the world that understands long-term returns, Constellation and Markel are just renowned. And it's so fun that you get to partake in this. I mean, again, I just sense that you would be a kid with candy, it just reinforces just this wealth of history and wisdom that you get to bring. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me too. I have been on other boards where the fit was not as perfect, and my advice to colleagues and friends who wonder about board service, um, whether to consider it, how to cultivate it, related questions. The big thing I report all the time is finding the right fit. That anything that's not the right fit, just say no. If you find the right fit, then by all means. And that's what's wonderful about these opportunities, these services. I feel like I add value. I feel like I'm contributing something positive. And so neither being a potted plant nor a thorn in the side, which I've done both of those, and it's not worth doing, really, for me at least. And so you're absolutely right, kid in a candy store. The ecosystem of which those companies are a part is a very special. You called it value investing. I think it's a good name for it. It's coming out of the Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett tradition, and it includes that quality shareholder concept. So that Berkshire, Markel, Constellation, all have very high densities of quality shareholders, and Kelly is on a conscious effort to cultivate that cohort. So that's a big part of the ecosystem.
You had brought up the question around how do people select the right board or how do they get on boards. I'd love for you to define a little bit more about that journey of fit. To you, it sounds very instinctual because it's so intrinsic to who you are in knowing this is a good fit or not a good fit. How did you know it, when you said yes and then realized it was not a good fit? Is there anything you could share with my audience around that journey?
Well, yeah, I guess instinctual is a big part of it. There is perhaps there's some manifestations, some articulated philosophy or some personality that can help a person conduct a filter like that or feel the instincts. But one example that I can share is I have on a few occasions been asked to serve as a director nominee in a contested proxy battle,
Okay.
or election situation,
Yeah.
and I mentioned earlier in this podcast that at Skadden Arps I was exposed to the litigation team, and I discovered I liked corporate better, and that's partly because I'm not pugnacious. I am more of a negotiator and seeing the win-win rather than in a fight
Russell.
over a pie. And so those contested proxy situations sometimes have more of that battle mentality than the constructive mentality. And so in those settings, I've learned to watch more carefully what the dynamics are going to look like. So in just on one of the occasions, I ended up being seated on a board, and it was more of a combat situation than a partner. It certainly wasn't a part. It didn't feel like a partnership, and that was just, it's fine. And some people excel in those environments. So some people who really get that and like that, sort of exert maybe more exerting pressure and playing hard knuckle a little bit. There are people who enjoy that or are good at that. I determined that I wasn't, and so I would avoid that as just not a good
Good
fit.
fit.
Doesn't mean I exclude all of them. I have undertaken a couple where where ultimately we were able to figure out a little bit like I was at Boston College, that the sides are not as far apart as they thought, and that there's important middle ground, and let's try to unite around that. And I enjoyed that activity as well. But so yeah, to your colleagues or to your listeners who are wondering, I think it's a big principle of life to try to always find the place where you're going to add value rather than feel frustrated or subtracted.
Yeah, makes complete sense. Um, let's jump to the topic that kind of keeps on popping up in our conversation, this theme. You met a now billionaire years ago through Professor. Would love for you to just share kind of the genesis of how that started and where you guys are today.
Thanks, Chris. you've laid the groundwork well. So it was that I had come to know Warren Buffett when I was working as a corporate lawyer at Cravath, because we represented the other side in some transactions. Berkshire would be represented by its long-term outside counsel Munger, Tolles and Olson,
Yeah.
and then either tacitly or otherwise, they'd signal on a certain transaction, we'd like for you to be buying a business. We'd like for you to be represented by Cravath. And also Cravath was still is Warren's estate planning law firm. So I had some exposure to him. But at Cardozo, when I was asked to run the Heyman Center, and I told you this was going to be a vibrant program with lots of events and symposium and activities, I wanted to have a big conference. Cardozo is pretty famous for mounting 3-day symposia on major topics of jurisprudence, and they did conferences on Kant and Hegel and Derrida. I said, I'd like to do one on Buffett. My very high wattage intellectual colleagues thought, well, okay, he's not Kant or Hegel, but he is the Kant or Hegel of finance and of governance and of business. So they all supported the idea. But then we wondered, well, how am I going to get Warren? And well, it turned out my professor, Elliot Weiss, had been on a committee with Warren, created by the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, to improve the quality of disclosure, of written disclosure in SEC filings. Instead of the gobbledygook and the technical legalese, this commission promoted plain English, and Elliot and Warren worked on it together. Obviously, Warren's a master of that. Elliot is a big champion of it. And so Elliot said, by all means, you can get Warren, you should get Warren. So we asked my dean, another player in this story, Monroe Price, can you help me, make the contact? He reached out to his friend, Bob Denham, who's a partner at Munger, Tolles and Olson, who called me and said, sure, describe the program, what you'd like to do, and I'll tee it up with Warren. So I described how it would be a mixture of governance, finance, acquisitions, capital allocation, markets, tax, and they loved it. Didn't hear from him for about 6 weeks. And this is back in the old days. We didn't have cell phones or text messaging or emails even really much. So 6 weeks wasn't as long as it would seem now, but it still felt long to me.
Yeah.
And at one point after 6 weeks, I was talking to Sam Butler at Cravath, who represented him. I said, I was trying to reach out to Warren. Maybe he just doesn't like this idea. He said, no, he's been traveling in China with Bill Gates, so that explains the delay. And again, back then, being in China meant you were really on the other side of the world. Today, we could talk to each other. So they said, everybody told me be patient. And finally, one day, I was in Washington. I was visiting at GW and got home from work. In those days, you didn't have a cell phone with a voicemail. You'd have an answering machine sitting at your home. So you get your messages at the end of the day. I got home, I pushed my messages, and I got one that said, oh, hey Larry, this is Warren Buffett calling about that symposium idea. I think it's great. Give me a call. And he gave me his number. And at first I was like, is this a joke? Is this a private? Friends of mine, because they knew I was on edge. But it was him. And so I called him, and he was just super supportive, and we went and executed. It was a wonderful, wonderful event. But getting it together took a little patience.
Amazing. When was that?
I think that happened in 1996, and then we had the event in 1997.
Awesome. Well, and I know on our episode 2, we're going to dive into that deeper and talk about those topics. I know you have sought Warren, and I don't want to be just sensitive to that relationship, but you've spoken to him about advice for joining boards. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think right before, I forget which one it was, but the board I was invited to serve on, I asked, I told him about it and asked for any advice, and he said, and this is only a slight quip. I mean, there's more to it, but he said, look, the most important thing, and your primary job as a director, the board's primary function, what they should do is pick an outstanding CEO and then stay out of his or her way. Uh, and in a different version of that, another colleague of mine said, pick a great CEO and then make sure he or she doesn't get too grabby.
Which can mean a lot of things, but I understand that.
I think he meant it deliberately. He's very good with words, and I think he meant it to include the whole range of bad behavior.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunately. Well, um, goodness, Larry, there's so much we could talk about, but this is episode 1 of 2. So, Larry, how can people find you, contact you, follow you on social media?
LinkedIn. There's another
Yeah,
nice contrast. Back in the last century that didn't happen, but LinkedIn. I enjoy that service and am visible there. So
excellent. Well, Larry, thank you for your time today. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
my pleasure, Chris. Thank you.